Movie star Audrey Hepburn turned heads on screen and in real life with her radiant beauty, grace, and style. She managed to mix an air of sophistication with innocent charm in a combination that endeared her to millions around the world. When not acting, Hepburn was known for her tireless efforts on behalf of children in need. It was a drive rooted in her own experience as a child in World War II when she endured Nazi occupation and risked her life to help the Dutch resistance. Below are 20 things about her and other stars in real-life war. Before she became an international star, Audrey Hepburn helped the Dutch resistance in World War II. British movie star Audrey Hepburn was an icon of both fashion and Hollywood's golden age. She was inducted into the International Best Dressed List Hall of Fame, and was ranked by the American Film Institute as one of the greatest female screen legends of classical Hollywood. Her rise to international stardom began in 1953, when she appeared alongside Gregory Peck in the romantic comedy Roman Holiday, and became the first actress to win an Oscar, a Golden Globe, and a BAFTA for a single performance. Less known about her is that before she rose to fame and fortune, a teenage child, Audrey Hepburn had helped the Dutch resistance in World War II. She was born Audrey Kathleen Ruston in 1929 in Brussels, to a British father and a Dutch aristocratic mother. Her parents eventually divorced, and in 1939, 10-year-old Audrey, her siblings, and her mother moved to Arnhem, in the Netherlands. When the Germans invaded and conquered that country in 1940, Audrey found herself under Nazi occupation. As seen below, despite her tender years, she decided to do something about that. This star had a rough childhood under the Nazis. When World War II began in 1939, Audrey Hepburn's mother moved her family from Belgium to the Netherlands in the hope that, as had happened in World War I, the Dutch would remain neutral. Hepburn was enrolled in a conservatory, where she was taught and honed her skills as a ballerina. Unfortunately for the Netherlands' neutrality, Hitler and the Nazis had other ideas, and on May 10, 1940, the Germans invaded. After a brief resistance, the massively outnumbered and overwhelmed Dutch were forced to surrender 4 days later. Like the rest of the Dutch, Hepburn and her family suffered great privations under Nazi occupation. In 1942, the Germans executed her uncle in retaliation for sabotage by the resistance. Even though he had not been involved, Hepburn's half-brother was deported to Germany to toil for the Nazis as a slave worker, and another sibling went into hiding to avoid the same thing happening to him. As Hepburn recalled years later, had we known that we were going to be occupied for 5 years, we might have all shot ourselves. We thought it might be over next week, 6 months next year. That's how we got through. It was thus understandable that Hepburn wanted to do what she could against the Nazis. She had trained as a ballerina and dancer from a young age, and she put those talents to use to help the Dutch resistance. A star who supported the resistance through dance. Audrey Hepburn danced and performed in illegal underground recitals, known as Zwarte Avonden, Black Evenings, and donated her earnings to the resistance. This despite her enfeebled physical condition. After the Nazis squeezed the Netherlands hard for resources to fuel their war effort, within a few years Hepburn, like many other Dutch, began to suffer from malnutrition. She still danced, however, as she put it, "It was some way in which I could make some kind of contribution." She also acted as a child courier, used because her youth made her less suspicious in the eyes of German occupiers. She carried documents, coded messages, and other items between various resistance groups. On one occasion, she recalled, "I had to step in and deliver our tiny underground newspaper. I stuffed them in my woolen socks and my wooden shoes. I got on my bike and delivered them." In the last few months of the war, a German blockade of food to the Netherlands led to a famine known as the Hunger Winter. Hepburn and her family subsisted on minuscule food amounts, including tulip bulbs. The time the Netherlands was liberated at the war's end, she and her family were close to starvation. As she put it, "We lost everything, of course, but we didn't give a hoot. We got through with our lives, which was all that mattered." Soon after the war she moved to Britain, got her first film role in 1948, and went on to star in dozens more movies. She never forgot her childhood experience in wartime. Hepburn eventually became a special ambassador for United Nations Children's Fund, UNICEF, an organization dedicated to providing humanitarian aid to children worldwide. A star comedienne who was once a U.S. Marine. Star comedienne, actress, and singer Beatrice B. Arthur had a rich career in entertainment that spanned 7 decades. In that stretch she became famous for her signature sitcom roles as Maude Findlay in All in the Family and its spin-off Maude, and as Dorothy Zbornak in The Golden Girls. Before that, however, she had been a World War II U.S. Marine. B attended a girls' boarding school where she was the tallest pupil, and was also voted wittiest girl by her classmates. She became an avid participant in drama programs and theatrical productions. Arthur entertained her friends with imitations of Mae West and fantasized about a career in show business, but did not think that her parents would support her dreams. Arthur downplayed her World War II contributions and often denied that she had served. She often steered questioners away by pointing out that others had done far more in the war. However, the documentary record shows that in 1943, when she was 21, Arthur enlisted in the U.S. Marine Corps under her birth name Bernice Frankel. She worked as a typist and truck driver and moved up the ranks, from private staff sergeant before her honorable discharge in 1945. While serving in the Marines during the war, she met and married her husband, Robert Arthur, whose last name she took. The marriage was short-lived, but she kept the name and became Beatrice B. Arthur. In hindsight, admirers of her no-nonsense character would probably nod their heads at how apt it is that Maud, or Dorothy Zabornak, had been a United States Marine sergeant. The man behind an iconic Star Trek phrase. "Beam me up, Scotty," is probably Star Trek's most iconic phrase. To hear it instantly conjures up the Enterprise's miracle worker chief engineer, who commanded the spaceship and recorded its log when the captain and first officer were absent. The franchise's second most memorable phrase is probably "I'm giving it all she's got, Captain, she can't take any more," delivered in a thick Scottish burr by the Enterprise's engineer. It is ironic because the actor who played Montgomery Scotty Scott did not have a Scottish accent in real life. For that matter, James Montgomery Doohan was not even from Scotland. Instead, Doohan was a Canadian who had earned a reputation as the most versatile voice actor in the business before he was cast for his defining role in Star Trek. Before he took up acting, however, Doohan had been a real-life, honest-to-goodness World War II hero who personally killed Nazis in combat, was struck by bullets multiple times on D-Day, and had a middle finger shot off. Scotty went from playing soldier in high school to the real thing. Jimmy Doohan was the youngest of 4 children born to Irish immigrants in Vancouver, British Columbia. His mother was a homemaker, while his father earned money as a dentist, a veterinarian and a pharmacist who owned and operated a chemist shop. Doohan's dad was an enterprising and talented amateur scientist who reportedly invented an early form of octane gas in 1923. However, he was also a serious alcoholic, and the heavy boozing got in the way of success and kept him from following up on his discovery and cashing in. The future Star Trek icon took up after his father in his love of science and enrolled in a technical high school where he excelled at science and mathematics. He also joined the Royal Canadian Cadet Corps, Canada's version of high school ROTC, in 1938. World War II kicked off a year later, and Doohan went from playing soldier in high school to the real thing. He joined the Royal Canadian Artillery early in the conflict. He was first assigned to the 2nd Canadian Infantry Division's 14th Midland Field Battery, before he was commissioned as a lieutenant and assigned to the 3rd Canadian Division's 14th Field Artillery Regiment. "We were more afraid of drowning than we were of the Germans." Jimmy Doohan's unit was shipped to England in 1940. Over the next few years, the Canadians garrisoned the British Isles against a threatened German onslaught and trained for an eventual invasion to retake Europe from the Nazis, aside from a failed raid on Dieppe in 1942 that turned into a catastrophe, and which Doohan luckily missed. The Canadian ground forces saw next to no combat. Eventually they began to get antsy after years of constant training with little action, and from the snide comments directed their way, that sarcastically referred to them as the world's best trained soldiers. Doohan and the Canadian ground formations finally got their first taste of combat in the Normandy invasion, when they landed at Juno Beach on D-Day, June 6, 1944. They were supposed to disembark in the pre-dawn darkness, but rough sea conditions delayed their amphibious assault until well after sunrise. Doohan and his comrades were undaunted. Years later, the Star Trek engineer described the experience of being on a landing craft as it approached the enemy shore. "We were more afraid of drowning than we were of the Germans." Before Star Trek, there was the Normandy campaign. Jimmy Doohan had cause for confidence, as the superbly trained Canadians turned out to be more than a match for the German defenders. However, it was no cakewalk. For one thing, the invasion planners had overestimated the effectiveness of heavy aerial bombardment that had targeted the beaches in the days and weeks before the invasion. It was assumed that the aerial raids would have destroyed or seriously damaged the German fortifications and inflicted such heavy losses so as to enable the attackers to advance against relatively little opposition. Those estimates turned out to be overly optimistic, and things did not work out quite that way on the actual day of battle. Intense Allied aerial attacks in the run-up to D-Day wreaked havoc on German infrastructure, road and rail transport, and communications hubs throughout Normandy and northern France. However, bombing proved largely ineffective against the actual defenders on the beaches targeted for amphibious attacks on June 6 and left them mostly unscathed. The first wave of Canadians to disembark from their landing craft were mowed down by Germans who fired from heavily fortified and well-situated positions that overlooked the beaches. Fortunately for Star Trek fans, Doohan was not among those killed that day. Scotty had his hands full on D-Day. Jimmy Doohan and his fellow Canadian attackers were temporarily pinned down by intense fire. Their advance came to a halt until they were saved by the timely intervention of a British light cruiser HMS Ajax. The Ajax's guns blasted the defenders and wrecked their positions, from what amounted to point-blank range for naval fire. She kept it long enough for the Canadians on the beaches to move inland. Doohan led his men over the wet sands, which were strewn with anti-tank mines that luckily did not go off because the men did not weigh enough to trigger them. The future Star Trek star and his unit were ordered to secure the Caen Bayou Road. They were also tasked with seizing an airport west of Caen, a key city in the path of an Allied advance. Caen's German defenders would give the Allies serious headaches for a considerable time to come, as Doohan's unit made its way off Juno Beach, and to higher ground inland. He came across and personally killed a pair of German snipers. Despite the early difficulties on the beach that morning, he and his men managed to secure their assigned D-Day objectives by noon on June 6. Star Trek's iconic engineer was shot 6 times by his own side. Chaos reigned on the beaches behind Jimmy Doohan and his men. Reinforcements and follow-up units arrived faster than the beach masters, tasked with directing them to their destinations, could handle. Soon there was a huge snarl on the beaches and throughout much of the ground recently liberated by the Allies, as different units were jammed next to and mixed with each other. It was not just messy, but also dangerous. Without well-defined unit boundaries, jittery troops, many of them experiencing combat for the first time, were liable to shoot up their comrades as they mistook them for Germans. Doohan would experience that firsthand. Around 11:30 p.m. on D-Day, as Star Trek's iconic engineer made his way to a command post, a nervous Canadian sentry opened up on him with a burst from a Bren gun. Doohan was struck by 6 bullets, 4 of them hit his legs, 1 struck his chest, and another shot off the middle finger of his right hand. It could have been worse. The bullet that hit him in the chest was deflected by a silver cigarette case, a gift from his brother. As Doohan joked about it in later years, smoking had actually saved his life. It was no laughing matter at the time, however, as he writhed in pain while being rushed to a hospital to get his wounds treated. The craziest pilot in the Canadian Air Force. After he recovered from the injuries sustained in Normandy, Jimmy Doohan signed up to train as a pilot and fly an artillery observer aircraft. Soon as he got his wings, he was assigned to fly a Taylorcraft Oster Mark B plane for No. 666 Aerial Observation Post Squadron. He served in that billet until war's end. Although he was technically not a member of the Royal Canadian Air Force, Doohan earned a reputation as the craziest pilot in the Canadian Air Force. Among other things, Star Trek's engineer once got in serious trouble after he slalomed his plane between telegraph posts, just to prove it could be done. When the war ended, Doohan was demobilized and sent back home, where he resumed his technical education. One day after he heard a crappy voice acting in a radio drama, he figured that he could do better. He turned out to be right, helped in no small part by a talent for accents that he had since childhood. So Doohan went to a drama school in Toronto, then earned a scholarship to study drama in New York City. From the terrors of war to Star Trek. By 1946, Jimmy Doohan had secured several radio roles with the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, CBC. Over the next few years he shuttled between Toronto and NYC as work demanded, and eventually performed in what he estimated to have been about 4,000 radio gigs, and 450 TV ones. By the 1960s he was making regular appearances on TV, with credits that included The Twilight Zone, Bonanza, Bewitched, The Fugitive, The Outer Limits, and Hazel. His big break came when he auditioned for the role of chief engineer in Star Trek, and producer Gene Roddenberry asked him what accent best suited the role. "If you want an engineer, in my experience the best engineers are Scotsmen," was Doohan's reply. And that is why Star Trek's engineer had such a thick Scottish accent. Doohan was cast as the Enterprise's engineer in the series' second pilot, Where No Man Has Gone Before, with the name Montgomery Scotty Scott, after the actor's grandfather. Scotty spoke in an Aberdeen accent that Doohan had once heard, but he almost ended up cut from the show after Roddenberry had second thoughts, and wrote to tell him, "We don't think we need an engineer in the series." The character remained only after Duan's agent intervened. World War II eventually claimed Scotty, but not until he was 85. Scotty became one of Star Trek's defining characters. He possessed a depth of technical savvy that frequently allowed him to come up with creative and unconventional fixes to solve seemingly insurmountable problems. He frequently bridged the gap between Captain Kirk's ambitious plans and his ship's capabilities, encapsulated by the iconic phrases, "I'm giving it all she's got, Captain. She can't take any more." Moreover, with an identity strongly connected to the Enterprise, Audrey brought the inanimate ship to life as a character in its own right. By the third season, Roddenberry was glad that he had kept him in the show. He wrote in a memo that Duan was capable of handling everything we throw at him, and praised the doer Scott. After the series ended, however, Duan discovered that rather than further his career, his successful role as Scotty had typecasted him, and he found it difficult to land different roles. He eventually accepted that he would always be Scotty, and made a living from personal appearances. Indeed, he was one of the few cast members who actually enjoyed meeting fans and talking about the Star Trek days. He lived to age 85 and died in 2005 from pulmonary fibrosis caused by exposure to harmful substances in World War II. Before he became a global star, the world's most famous mime fought in the Resistance. Marceau became an international star as the world's most famous mime. His white-faced character, the melancholy vagabond Bip, became globally famous from TV and stage appearances. Among many accomplishments in his long and eventful career, Marceau won an Emmy Award and got declared a national treasure in Japan despite the fact that he was not even Japanese. He was also admitted to the Berlin Academy of Fine Arts as a member, and became a decades-long friend of Michael Jackson. Indeed, the King of Pop borrowed some of Marceau's moves and used them in his dance routines. Before he became world famous, however, Marceau spent most of the Second World War in hiding and working for the French resistance. After the Allies landed in France in 1944, he gave his first major performance before an audience of 3,000 troops in recently liberated Paris. He then joined the Free French Army for the remainder of the war. Marceau's talent for languages and near fluency in English and German led to his appointment as a liaison officer with General George S. Patton's 3rd U.S. Army. Marceau's talent as a mime saved lives. The world's most famous mime was born Marcel Mangel into a Jewish family in Strasbourg, France. His father was a kosher butcher originally from Poland, and his mother hailed from what is now Ukraine. The family had to hide its Jewish origins when the Nazis invaded and conquered France in 1940. They fled to central France, but the father was captured in 1944 and sent to Auschwitz, where he perished. Marcel moved to Paris with a new name and forged identity papers. The future star went underground in the French capital, adopted the surname Marceau after a French Revolutionary War general, and joined the resistance. His underground activities included the rescue of many Jewish children from German clutches. His talent for miming, a career to which he had aspired ever since he first saw a Charlie Chaplin movie when he was 5 years old, came in handy. He used it to distract and quiet the children as he smuggled them past German guards and across the border to safety in Switzerland. A movie star who started his career in the British Army. British movie star David Niven led a rich life as a memoirist and novelist, and most significantly as a perennially popular character actor. His accolades include an Oscar for Best Actor for his role in the 1958 movie Separate Tables. He also won acclaim for his roles as Phileas Fogg in Around the World in 80 Days, as the Phantom in The Pink Panther, and as a squadron leader in A Matter of Life and Death. He was born into a comfortable bourgeoisie family, whose antecedents included a lieutenant general in the British Army. Niven lost his father in 1915 when the latter was killed in the Gallipoli campaign. His mother remarried a knight with whom she had been having an affair before she was widowed, and who was probably David's biological father. The young Niven exhibited a wicked sense of humor from early on, perhaps too much so, as his propensity for pranks often earned him corporal punishment at his preparatory school. He took his licks and kept pranking until administrators expelled him when he was 10. That doomed his chances of getting into Eton, the elite private school his parents had hoped to send him to, so they sent him to the era's dumping ground for the unpromising scions of Britain's elite, the Royal Military College, Sandhurst, from which he graduated in 1930, 2 years in the military. Niven resigned his commission and left for Hollywood to become an actor. In World War II, this thespian alternated between acting and service with the commandos. David Niven got a series of bit parts in the 1930s, However, just when he began to attract attention in Hollywood as a potential star and was about to break through, World War II broke out first. Niven returned home and rejoined the British Army as a lieutenant in a motor training battalion. He craved more excitement, however, so he transferred to the elite commandos. There he was assigned to the GHQ Liaison Regiment, a special reconnaissance unit known as the Phantom Signals Unit. Along the way he put his acting experience to use and was temporarily detached to the Army Film Unit, where he acted in 2 war films. He returned to the commandos for the 1944 Normandy campaign. In Normandy, Niven located and reported on German positions and liaised with commanders in the rear to apprise them of frontline conditions. Despite his reputation as a great storyteller and exceptional raconteur, Niven remained tight-lipped about his wartime experiences until his dying day, and was contemptuous of those who glorified their service. He once explained that reluctance thus: "I will however tell you just one thing about the war, my first story and my last. I was asked by some American friends to search out the grave of their son near Bastonia. I found it where they told me I would, but it was among 27,000 others, and I told myself that here in Niven were 27,000 reasons why you should keep your mouth shut after the war." A star comedian who fought the Nazis. Brooklyn-born star comedian Mel Brooks is best known for directing hilarious comedies like Spaceballs, Blazing Saddles, The Producers, and Robin Hood Men in Tights. He is not somebody most people would associate with life and death type of dangerous work. Yet, that is precisely what Mel Brooks did in World War II, when he fought the Nazis as a combat engineer who cleared minefields under enemy fire and was in the thick of the Battle of the Bulge. As he put it, "I was a combat engineer." Isn't that ridiculous? The 2 things I hate most in the world are combat and engineering. He was born Melvin James Kaminsky in 1926, descended from German Jews on his father's side and Ukrainian Jews on his mother's. Brooks was raised in poverty after his father's untimely death. When the future comedian was only 2 years old, understandably growing up without a father was rough, and it left its mark on Brooks as a child and into his adulthood. As he put it decades later, "There's an outrage there. I may be angry at God or at the world for that, and I'm sure a lot of my comedy is based on anger and hostility." A precocious comedic talent. Mel Brooks grew up small and sickly in a borderline slum in Brooklyn, where he developed a sense of humor and a precocious comedic talent early on. It came in handy and helped him diffuse confrontations and avoid getting picked on and beaten up. Most people in his neighborhood worked in New York's Garment District, but when Brooks was 9, an uncle took him to see a musical comedy on Broadway. After the show, the awestruck child declared his determination to never end up in the Garment District, but to become a showbiz star instead. It was not just a child's brief flight of fancy. From then on, Brooks rolled up his metaphorical sleeves and set about making his wish come true. By the time he was 14, he had secured himself a gig as an entertainer at a swimming pool, and kept the crowds in stitches with his slapstick routines. At 14, Brooks also apprenticed with jazz bandleader and drummer Buddy Rich, who taught him how to play the drums. Brooks thus added musician to his repertoire. He also changed his name from Mel Kaminsky to Mel Brooks, to avoid getting confused with jazz bandleader Max Kaminsky. A self-described peacenik who set his beliefs aside to fight Hitler. Music gave Mel Brooks an unexpected entry into the world of stand-up comedy. When he was 16 years old, he was doing a gig as a drummer when an MC came down with an illness and was unable to perform. Brooks stepped in as a pinch hitter, and he hit it out of the park. Things were going well for the young comedian, and he was en route to realizing his childhood dream of becoming a professional entertainer. Then his budding showbiz career was interrupted by World War II. Brooks graduated high school in 1944, with nebulous plans to go to college and study psychology, but then decided to join the U.S. Army. As the future comedy star described his decision, "I enlisted to go to college, not to be in foxholes and shot at, but listen, that's what happens in a war. Being a kid of 17, 18, I was a peacenik. I was against war, but I knew what Hitler was doing to Jews. So I really did feel this was a proper and just war, and a war that should be fought. My mother had 4 stars in her window. I think the limit was 3 if you had children in the army, that is. I think I could have gotten out of it, but I was gung-ho at being a soldier.